The cold night that changed everything. The wind howled across the icy wastelands of Valaris 7, a frozen backwater on the outer edges of the Orion fringe. Ethan Drake pulled his coat tighter against the biting chill as he stepped out of the dimly lit cantina, his breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. The colony's power grid was failing again, flickering neon lights barely cast enough glow to see through the falling snow. He wasn't supposed to be here. His ship, the Wayfarer, had made an unscheduled stop for fuel and supplies, but something about this world unsettled him. A gut feeling. Years of surviving the worst parts of the galaxy had taught him to trust his instincts. And right now, his instincts were screaming at him to leave. Then he saw her. A lone figure huddled under a flickering streetlight, barely covered by a thin, tattered cloak. Her skin, a deep violet hue, was unlike anything he had seen before. Snow clung to her long silver hair, and her iridescent eyes barely reflected the dim light. She was shaking uncontrollably, arms wrapped around herself in a feeble attempt to ward off the cold. Ethan hesitated. Helping strangers was a bad habit in this part of the galaxy. It was the kind of thing that got people killed. But something about her, the quiet way she endured the cold, the way her breath came in short, desperate gasps, made him move before he could think. Shrugging off his jacket, he stepped forward and draped it over her shoulders. "Here," he muttered. "Looks like you need this more than I do." She flinched at first, then turned to face him, eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, she just stared at him, as if struggling to understand why he would do such a thing. Then, with trembling hands, she clutched the jacket tighter around herself. Tears welled in her eyes. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice soft, musical, but laced with exhaustion. Ethan shrugged. "Call it a loan. Just don't let it go to waste." Her fingers tightened around the fabric, her body still trembling. But now, it wasn't just from the cold. Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Don't mention it," Ethan said. "But you really shouldn't be out here alone. Especially not looking like you do." At that, her expression darkened. A flicker of fear crossed her face. "Are you running from someone?" he asked, his instincts kicking in. She hesitated. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand through his short, dark hair. Of course she was. Before he could press further, a distant sound cut through the wind, a low whirring hum that sent a chill down his spine. Hover bikes. Not good. The woman stiffened. Ethan turned his head just in time to see three figures on sleek, black grav bikes emerging from the swirling snow. Their helmets glowed red, their rifles slung low but ready. Ethan didn't need an introduction. He knew exactly who they were. Bounty hunters. And judging by the way the woman beside him gripped his jacket with renewed desperation, he had just walked into something far bigger than himself. "Stay close," Ethan muttered. "Things are about to get messy." Hunted in the snow. The low hum of grav bikes sent a sharp wave of adrenaline through Ethan's system. He'd been around bounty hunters enough times to recognize their movements, calculated, predatory, and efficient. 3 riders. 1 on point, 2 flanking. They weren't just here to scare someone off. They were here for her. Ethan barely had a second to react before the lead rider raised his weapon, a sleek plasma carbine, the kind that could melt through reinforced hull plating if set to full charge. "Step away from the girl, human," a heavily distorted voice growled from the helmet's comm system. Ethan didn't move. He wasn't an idiot. He was, however, a survivor. The woman, Lyra, gripped the edges of his jacket tightly, her fingers trembling against the fabric. Fear flickered in her eyes, but there was something else there too. A quiet determination. "Why don't we skip the part where you threaten me?" Ethan said casually, raising his hands in a show of fake compliance. "And get straight to what you actually want." She's property, the hunter snapped. Belongs to Lord Catherine. You're interfering in matters beyond your understanding. Ethan's stomach tightened. Lord Catherine. The name alone was enough to make most people in the galaxy shut up and run. A warlord with a private army, black market dealings, and enough influence to make entire colonies disappear overnight. Ethan sighed, muttering under his breath. Of course. Of all the people I could accidentally piss off, it just had to be one of the worst ones. Lyra's grip on his sleeve tightened. Please, she whispered. We have to run. One of the bounty hunters scoffed. There's nowhere to. Ethan moved before the sentence was finished. Fast. Brutal. His hand shot to the pulse pistol on his hip, drawing and firing in the same motion. The first shot hit the lead bounty hunter dead center in the chest, sending his body flying off the bike and into the snow. The other two barely had time to react before Ethan grabbed Lyra's wrist and ran. Plasma bolts hissed past them, melting the snow where they had stood just seconds ago. The hunters were fast, but Ethan had spent years dodging people just like them. And more importantly, humans never ran in a straight line. He ducked low, weaving between rusted cargo containers and wrecked speeders, his mind already calculating the best route out of this mess. This way, he shouted, yanking Lyra into a narrow alley between two crumbling buildings. The cold bit at his skin, but he pushed through it. Survival first. Pain later. Behind them, the remaining two bounty hunters were closing in. The grav bike's engines howled through the storm, their searchlights slicing through the darkness like knives. We can't outrun them forever, Lyra panted. Ethan knew she was right. And he also knew what had to happen next. Time to get creative. He pulled Lyra behind a stack of abandoned fuel canisters, pressing a finger to his lips. Stay quiet. Whatever happens next, don't move until I say. She hesitated, then nodded. Ethan exhaled, steadying his breathing. Then, with the kind of reckless confidence that only a human could pull off, he grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the snow and hurled it into a nearby cargo crate. The loud clatter echoed through the alleyway. The bounty hunters snapped toward the sound instantly, opening fire. Bright blue plasma bolts tore through the cargo, sending debris flying. Ethan moved in the opposite direction. With a sprinting leap, he grabbed onto a fire escape ladder, hauling himself up onto the rooftops. The cold wind howled against him, but he ignored it. From his new vantage point, he spotted the two hunters below. Still focused on the decoy. Perfect, Ethan muttered. Then he jumped. The impact was brutal. He crashed onto one of the riders, knocking them clean off the grav bike. The hunter hit the ground with a sickening crunch, his weapon flying into the snow. The second hunter snapped his rifle upward, but Ethan was already moving. A single, well-placed kick sent the gun spinning away into the storm. The bounty hunter barely had time to register what happened before Ethan grabbed him by the helmet and slammed his head against the bike's control panel. The hunter went limp. The only sound left was the wind howling through the alley. Ethan stood there for a moment, his breath coming in short bursts. His heart pounded against his ribs. The entire fight had lasted no more than 30 seconds. And somehow, he was still alive. Lyra stepped out from behind the canisters, her expression a mix of shock and something else. Admiration. You just. Later, Ethan interrupted, climbing onto the grav bike. Get on. She hesitated for only a second before swinging onto the seat behind him. Hold on tight, Ethan warned, gripping the bike's controls. This is gonna get rough. The bike roared to life. Then they were gone, vanishing into the blizzard. The hunt wasn't over. It was just getting started. No way back. The grav bike tore through the snowstorm at reckless speed, its thrusters leaving a trail of heat in the frigid air. Ethan gritted his teeth as the wind slashed against his exposed skin. Lyra clung tightly to his back, her grip firm but shaking. They weren't safe yet. Behind them, a distant wharf signaled that more bounty hunters were giving chase. The bodies Ethan had left behind wouldn't slow them for long. If anything, it would make them more determined to hunt him down. Lyra shifted, her voice barely audible over the roaring wind. "Where are we going?" "Anywhere but here," Ethan shouted back. The colony of Valaris 7 stretched out ahead, a skeletal maze of half-frozen buildings and forgotten tech from an age when this planet actually mattered. Now, it was a lawless wasteland, a place where debts went unpaid and people disappeared without a trace. A perfect place to be hunted. Ethan's eyes scanned the landscape ahead, looking for an exit strategy. They needed somewhere to hide. Somewhere the bounty hunters wouldn't immediately check. Then he saw it. A derelict mining outpost, half buried in the ice. The old colony records mentioned these places, deep tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the surface. They had been abandoned decades ago when the local minerals ran dry. But right now, it was the best shot they had. Ethan yanked the bike into a hard turn, nearly sending them skidding across the ice. Lyra gasped, her grip tightening, but she didn't complain. She was trusting him. That was good. Because he wasn't sure even he trusted himself right now. The outpost loomed ahead, its rusted metal doors barely visible beneath layers of frost. The storm was getting worse, reducing visibility to near zero. It was a gamble. But humans thrived on gambles. "Hold on," Ethan shouted, then gunned the thrusters. The grav bike surged forward. The bike hit the frozen ground hard as they skidded to a stop inside the mining outpost. The second they were inside, Ethan killed the engine and jumped off. "Inside. Now," he ordered. Lyra didn't hesitate. She rushed through the icy steel doors, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. Ethan followed close behind, slamming the control panel with his fist. The door hissed, then groaned shut under its own weight, locking them in darkness. Silence. For a long moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Ethan leaned against the metal wall, feeling the rush of adrenaline finally catch up with him. "That was reckless," Lyra muttered between gasps. Ethan let out a short laugh. "Yeah, well, it worked, didn't it?" Lyra didn't answer. Instead, she pulled his jacket closer around herself, still shivering from the cold. That was when Ethan realized she was in bad shape. Her skin was too pale, her breathing uneven. Even her hands, clutching the edges of his jacket, were trembling, and not just from the cold. "Hey," he said, crouching down to meet her eyes. "You okay?" She hesitated. Then, a slow, reluctant shake of her head. "I haven't eaten in 2 days," she admitted. Ethan cursed under his breath. "Okay. Stay here." He unzipped his pack, rummaging through whatever supplies he had left. It wasn't much, a few ration bars, a half-filled canteen of water. But it was something. "Here." He handed her a ration bar. "Eat." Lyra took it, but her hands were so unsteady that Ethan had to guide it toward her mouth. She took a small bite, then another. A moment later, she closed her eyes, relief washing over her face. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "You should have said something sooner." Lyra swallowed, then looked at him with those strange, iridescent eyes. "I didn't know if I could trust you." That caught Ethan off guard. He raised an eyebrow. "And now?" She held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Trust. That was a dangerous thing. Especially out here." Ethan pushed the thought aside. "Rest a little," he said, standing. "We're gonna be here a while." Ethan scouted the outpost while Lyra recovered. The place was even worse than he thought. It wasn't just abandoned. It was wrecked. Most of the tunnels had collapsed, and half the systems were dead. The only good news was that the lower levels still had geothermal vents. It wouldn't be warm, but it would be warm enough. That meant they had time. But not much. Ethan was just about to head back when he noticed something. A faint red glow blinking on one of the walls. He narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. The old control panel was barely functional, but the power supply was still active. That was strange. He pressed a few buttons, pulling up the outpost's last recorded logs. What he saw made his blood run cold. Incoming transmission. Source, unknown. Message, confirmed location. Initiating pursuit. Timestamp, 5 minutes ago. Ethan swore. He turned just as Lyra entered the room, looking slightly better but still weak. "What is it?" she asked. Ethan exhaled, running a hand down his face. "They know we're here." Lyra's expression darkened instantly. "Then we have to go. Now." "Not yet," Ethan said, already scanning the console for options. "We still have a chance to turn this around." Lyra stared at him. "How?" Ethan looked up, his eyes sharp. "We don't run. We set a trap. The trap is set." Ethan's fingers moved quickly over the flickering control panel, scanning the old mining outpost's defenses. Most systems were dead, but there were a few surprises left. Traps. Automated security. Explosives. Lyra stood beside him, still wrapped in his jacket, her iridescent eyes scanning the data over his shoulder. "You really think we can turn this place into a stronghold?" Ethan smirked. "I don't think, sweetheart. I know." She exhaled, shaking her head. "Humans. Always so confident." "Not confidence," Ethan corrected, his fingers working fast. "Just knowing how to make the impossible work." He pulled up the old mining ventilation systems, some of them were still functional. If he rerouted the power, he could overheat the tunnels, filling them with blinding steam. He found the blast doors, most were jammed, but he could override one manually, forcing their pursuers into a bottleneck. And the best part? The outpost still had old mining charges buried in the walls. Not much. But enough. Ethan grinned. "Yeah, this'll work." Lyra crossed her arms. "You sound excited about this." "I love a good underdog fight," Ethan admitted, flashing her a roguish smile. "And humans? We fight best when our backs are against the wall." Lyra studied him for a moment, then let out a small, breathless laugh. "You're completely insane." Ethan winked. "That's why it'll work. Baiting the trap." Ethan and Lyra moved quickly, setting everything into place. The tunnels would be their battleground. The old mining shafts would confuse their enemies, making it impossible to chase them without risk. The steam vents would blind their vision, and the explosive charges would seal off exits. It wasn't just a defense. It was a slaughterhouse. Finally, Ethan checked his pulse pistol's power levels. Almost empty. Didn't matter. He'd make the shots count. Lyra finished planting the last mining charge and wiped her hands. "They're going to send a full team. Maybe a dozen men." "Good," Ethan said, standing up. "Means we won't have to go looking for them." Lyra stared at him. "You're really planning to go through with this?" Ethan tilted his head. "You got a better idea?" She hesitated. Then shook her head. "No. Then we stick to the plan." The storm arrives. The sound of approaching engines sent a sharp thrill through Ethan's spine. He and Lyra crouched behind a half-broken mining console, watching as 5 hoverbikes and a heavily armed transport came into view. Their pursuers had arrived. Ethan could see the leader now, a tall, armored bounty hunter with a cybernetic eye. His men spread out, moving with practiced precision. Professionals. This place is a damn wreck, one of the hunters muttered, sweeping the area with a rifle. The leader ignored him, his cybernetic eye glowing faintly. They're still here. He turned to his men. Spread out. Kill the human. Bring the girl back alive. Ethan exhaled slowly. Lyra's fingers brushed against his hand. A silent question. Ethan nodded. Showtime. The fight begins. The first explosion ripped through the mining tunnel, sending molten rock and steam into the air. The bounty hunters barely had time to react before the ventilation system blasted high-pressure steam, filling the area with thick, blinding fog. Ethan moved fast. He darted between the shadows, his pulse pistol flashing in the darkness. One shot hit a bounty hunter in the leg, sending him crashing into a metal beam. Another ducked behind cover, returning fire, but Ethan was already gone. Humans weren't the strongest species. They weren't the fastest. But they were the most unpredictable. Where the hell is he? One of the hunters shouted. Ethan dropped from the overhead piping, driving his elbow into the back of the man's skull. The bounty hunter crumpled. 2 down. 8 to go. Lyra was deadly in her own right. She moved like a ghost in the fog, her slender frame barely making a sound. A bounty hunter turned, only for her to slash his throat with a stolen vibroblade. They were winning. Then, a plasma bolt grazed Ethan's side. Pain flared through his ribs, sending him staggering back. The cybernetic leader emerged from the fog, his glowing eye locking onto Ethan. You fight well for a human, he admitted, leveling a massive shock baton. But your luck just ran out. Ethan grinned through the pain. You don't know much about humans, do you? The bounty hunter's cybernetic eye flickered. What? Ethan threw his pulse pistol aside and cracked his knuckles. When we run out of weapons, he said, we use our fists. The bounty hunter charged. Ethan met him halfway. The final blow. It was brutal. The bounty hunter was stronger, but Ethan was smarter. He dodged the first strike, but the second clipped his shoulder, sending pain lancing through his arm. Didn't matter. Ethan ducked low, grabbed a steel rod from the ground, and swung it into the hunter's knee. A sickening crack. The bounty hunter roared in pain, stumbling backward. Ethan didn't stop. Humans never stopped. He grabbed the bounty hunter by the helmet and slammed his skull against the nearest wall. The light in the cybernetic eye flickered. Then, darkness. The bounty hunter slumped to the floor. It was over. Lyra stood nearby, breathing heavily. Ethan wiped blood from his mouth, grinning. Told you it'd work. Lyra just stared at him. Then, she laughed. Ethan couldn't help but laugh too. Humans. They weren't the biggest, or the strongest, or the smartest. But they never gave up. And that? That made them unstoppable. No turning back. The silence after the fight felt almost unnatural. Ethan stood over the fallen bounty hunters, his breath heavy, pulse pounding. The metallic taste of blood lingered in his mouth, and the bruises forming along his ribs throbbed like hell. But they were alive. Lyra was still gripping a stolen vibroblade, her violet skin smeared with the blood of the fallen. She was breathing hard, but her eyes weren't afraid anymore. They had won. But winning didn't mean they were safe. Ethan crouched beside the cybernetic bounty hunter, the last one standing before Ethan had personally introduced his skull to a steel wall. His cybernetic eye was flickering, barely functional. Ethan grabbed the hunter by the collar, yanking him up. How many more are coming? The bounty hunter coughed, blood spilling from his lips. You think this is over, human, he growled. Lord Kethrin will send more. And next time, you won't see them coming. Ethan's expression darkened. Yeah. He pulled the hunter closer, his voice cold. Then give him a message for me. The bounty hunter glared at him. Ethan didn't hesitate. He slammed his fist into the cybernetic implant, sparks flying as it shattered. The bounty hunter crumpled, unconscious. Ethan exhaled, rolling his shoulders. That should do it. Lyra tilted her head. You let him live. Ethan wiped blood from his knuckles. No point in killing a messenger. Better to send a warning. She studied him, then nodded. That was very human of you. Ethan smirked. I'll take that as a compliment. The escape plan. They couldn't stay here. Ethan knew it. Lyra knew it. The bounty hunters had sent a transmission before arriving. That meant reinforcements would be coming. Soon. Ethan went back to the damaged console, trying to access what little was left of the mining outpost's records. A holographic map flickered to life, displaying a layout of the underground tunnels. Here, he pointed. There's an old transport shaft that leads to the surface. If we can get to it, we can hijack one of their ships and get off this rock. Lyra frowned. And if it doesn't work? Ethan grinned. Then we improvise. Lyra shook her head, but there was a hint of amusement in her expression. Humans are insane. You keep saying that, Ethan said, gathering supplies. And yet, you're still here. She didn't argue. Through the tunnels. The mining tunnels were dark and unstable. The deeper they went, the hotter it got. Steam hissed from the cracks in the rock, and the air was thick with the scent of metal and dust. Ethan moved carefully, pistol drawn. His wounds slowed him down, but he ignored them. Pain was temporary. Survival was everything. Lyra moved silently beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. Then, she grabbed his arm, pulling him to a stop. Ethan stiffened. What? She pointed. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a massive cavern. And in the center of it, a ship. It was a small transport vessel, rusted and worn, but space-worthy. Ethan grinned. That'll do. Lyra, however, wasn't smiling. She pointed toward the entrance. Guards. 3 armored figures patrolled near the ship. They were better equipped than the bounty hunters, military-grade weapons, reinforced armor, tactical gear. Ethan cursed under his breath. Catherine's personal security. Lyra frowned. Why would he send elites just to capture me? Ethan paused. That was a very good question. Lyra had never told him why Catherine was after her. He had assumed she was just another runaway, maybe an escaped prisoner, or someone who owed the wrong people a debt. But this? This was something bigger. Ethan turned to her, voice low. Lyra. What aren't you telling me? She hesitated. Now isn't the time. Ethan grabbed her wrist. We're risking our lives for this. I need to know. Lyra met his gaze. Then, she exhaled. I stole something from Catherine, she admitted. Something that could destroy him. Ethan's grip tightened. What is it? She glanced away. Proof, she said quietly. Proof that Catherine is working with the Crimson Syndicate. That he's selling outlawed planet-killer weapons to warlords across the sector. Ethan's breath hitched. Planet killers. Those weren't just weapons. They were genocide tools. And if Catherine was selling them to the syndicate, millions, maybe billions, of lives were at risk. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. You couldn't have mentioned that earlier. Lyra folded her arms. Would you have helped me if I did? Ethan hesitated. Then, he grinned. Yeah. Probably. Lyra blinked, startled. Why? Because, Ethan said, checking his pistol. Stopping genocidal maniacs is kinda a human thing. She stared at him for a long moment. Then, she smiled. You really are different from the others. Yeah, well, Ethan smirked. You aliens keep underestimating us. It's getting kinda old. Lyra shook her head. Let's just get out of here. Ethan nodded. Agreed. He cocked his pistol. Let's steal a ship. Stealing a future. The cavern was silent, save for the faint hum of the guard's power armor. Ethan and Lyra crouched behind a collapsed mining cart, their breath low, their movements controlled. The transport ship sat in the center of the cavern, its landing gear half frozen to the floor, its engines idling in standby mode. 3 guards. They weren't bounty hunters. They were something worse. Ethan could tell from the way they moved, tight formations, perfect coordination. These weren't just mercenaries. They were Catherine's personal enforcers. Elite. Ruthless. Unforgiving. Which meant they needed a plan. Ethan leaned close to Lyra, voice low. We go loud, they'll cut us down before we reach the ship. Lyra nodded. Then we don't go loud. Ethan smirked. You thinking what I'm thinking? She exhaled. I really hope not. But she was already reaching into her belt, pulling out the last of their stolen mining charges. Ethan grinned. I love this plan. The setup. It took 2 minutes to set the explosives. They placed them along the cavern walls, not enough to collapse the place, but enough to make things very, very distracting. Ethan slid into position behind a metal crate, pulse pistol at the ready. Lyra was across from him, crouched behind a steel pillar. They exchanged a look. You ready? Lyra nodded. Ethan pressed the detonator. The explosion. The cavern erupted. The walls shook, sending massive chunks of rock crashing down from above. A fireball burst from one of the charges, sending flames licking across the steel walls. The guards reacted instantly. They spun, weapons raised, voices barking commands into their helmets. But Ethan and Lyra were already moving. Ethan broke from cover, blasting the first guard in the back of the knee. The man stumbled, his armor sparking. Ethan didn't stop, he closed the distance, slamming his fist into the guard's throat before he could recover. The second guard turned, raising his rifle. Lyra was faster. She launched herself from the shadows, her stolen vibroblade slicing through his wrist. He screamed, just before she drove the blade into his chest. One left. The last guard had enough time to aim. Ethan saw the shot coming. He wasn't fast enough to dodge it. The plasma round hit him square in the shoulder, sending a blast of pain tearing through his body. But humans didn't go down easy. Ethan gritted his teeth, ignoring the fire in his nerves. He lunged forward, grabbed the guard's rifle, and twisted. The weapon fired into the ceiling, sending molten slag raining down. Ethan drove his knee into the guard's gut, then grabbed the man's helmet, slamming it against the steel floor. Once. Twice. The helmet cracked open. The body went still. Silence. Ethan panted, gripping his bleeding shoulder. He looked up, Lyra was staring at him, her expression unreadable. You're injured, she said. Ethan glanced at the wound. It was bad. But not lethal. He grinned. Yeah, well. I'm still standing. She shook her head. Humans are ridiculous. Ethan staggered toward the transport ship. You complaining? She sighed, following him up the boarding ramp. Not at all. The takeoff. Ethan collapsed into the pilot's seat, one hand pressing against his wound, the other flying across the controls. Can you fly? Lyra asked. Ethan snorted. Sweetheart, I could fly this thing in my sleep. He flipped the ignition. The engines roared to life, shaking off layers of frost. The ship hummed, systems lighting up across the dashboard. Then, a warning alarm blared. Ethan's stomach dropped. Lyra stiffened. What? Ethan scanned the console. Incoming energy signatures. He switched the external cameras. The cavern's outer entrance lit up with headlights. Catherine's ships. They had found them. Ethan clenched his jaw. All right. Looks like we're not going the quiet way after all. Lyra tightened the straps on her seat. I was afraid you'd say that. Ethan grinned, despite the pain. He grabbed the flight controls, and hit the thrusters. The chase. The transport ship blasted out of the cavern like a bat out of hell. The storm outside was blinding. The sky was a wall of white, snow and ice slamming against the hull. But Ethan didn't slow down. Behind them, the pursuit ships opened fire. The ship shook as plasma rounds grazed the engines. The warning system wailed, flashing critical alerts across the screen. Lyra braced herself. We can't outrun them. Ethan grinned. Who said anything about running? He yanked the controls, hard. The ship dove, twisting between jagged ice formations, flying lower than any sane pilot would dare. Lyra gripped the seat. Are you trying to get us killed? Ethan laughed. I'm improvising. This is improvising. Another plasma shot streaked past, narrowly missing the cockpit. Ethan's mind raced. They needed cover. Then, he saw it. A narrow canyon, barely wide enough for a ship to squeeze through. Ethan aimed straight for it. Lyra's eyes widened. You are insane. Yeah, Ethan admitted. But this might actually work. The ship plunged into the canyon. Behind them, the pursuit ships hesitated. The canyon was too tight. Too dangerous. Then, one of them tried to follow. Bad idea. The pilot miscalculated. His wing clipped the ice, sending his ship spinning into a jagged rock. The explosion lit up the storm. Lyra stared in disbelief. That actually worked. Ethan smirked. Told you. The remaining enemy ships pulled back. The canyon was too risky. They were free. For now. A new destination. Ethan exhaled, easing back into the seat. His shoulder was screaming, but they were alive. Lyra turned to him. Where are we going? Ethan thought for a moment. Then, he punched in coordinates. A place that hates Catherine almost as much as we do. Lyra frowned. Who? Ethan's grin turned sharp. The Galactic Patrol. Lyra's eyes widened. You want to hand them the evidence? Ethan nodded. And get their help taking Catherine down for good. Lyra was silent for a moment. Then, she smiled. All right, human. Let's change the galaxy. The final stand. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewport, but Ethan wasn't admiring the view. He leaned forward in the pilot's seat, hands gripping the controls as he guided their stolen transport ship toward the Galactic Patrol's flagship, the Dauntless. Lyra sat beside him, still wrapped in his worn jacket, her iridescent eyes scanning the incoming patrol ships. They're hailing us, she said. Ethan nodded, flipping the comm switch. Let's hope they're in a good mood. A sharp voice came through the speakers. Unidentified vessel, you are entering Galactic Patrol airspace. State your identity and purpose immediately. Ethan smirked. This is Ethan Drake, and I've got something you're gonna want to see. We have proof that Lord Catherine is selling planet-killer weapons to the Crimson Syndicate. Silence. Then. Transmit the data. Lyra tapped the console, sending the stolen files. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a new voice came through. Ethan Drake, Lyra, you are ordered to dock immediately. Do not deviate from your course. Ethan leaned back, exhaling. That went well. Lyra smirked. They don't trust us yet. Ethan grinned. They will. He guided the ship toward the massive flagship, docking smoothly. As the airlock hissed open, a squad of heavily armed patrol officers was waiting. And at the center, Commander Valen, the man who led the patrol's anti-crime division. His piercing silver eyes locked onto Ethan. You better hope this is real, human. Ethan smirked. Oh, it's real. And you're gonna love it. The truth exposed. The briefing room was silent as the data loaded onto the holoscreen. Catherine's secret arms deals. Weaponized nanotech. Planet killer missiles. Deals with warlords, slavers, and terrorist factions. Every crime laid bare. Commander Valen studied the files, his expression growing darker by the second. Finally, he turned to Ethan. This is enough to bring him down, he admitted. But Catherine is powerful. He'll see us coming. Ethan leaned forward, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Then we don't give him time to run. Valen raised an eyebrow. You have a plan? Ethan grinned. I always have a plan. Lyra sighed. Here we go again. The assault on Catherine's fortress. The battle began at dawn. The Dauntless led the attack, dropping shock troops onto Catherine's stronghold while Ethan and Lyra infiltrated from the ground. Blaster fire lit up the sky, explosions shook the battlefield, and the night was filled with the sounds of war. Catherine's forces were elite, but they weren't ready for a full-scale assault. And they definitely weren't ready for Ethan. The final confrontation. Ethan and Lyra fought their way through the stronghold, taking down guards, hacking into security, and making their way toward Catherine's throne room. The warlord was waiting. He was massive, his cybernetic enhancements glowing with power. You've been a thorn in my side for too long, human, Catherine growled. Ethan grinned. Yeah, we do that. Catherine lunged. The fight was brutal. Ethan dodged plasma blades, countered with his fists and stolen weapons, and refused to go down. Lyra moved like a shadow, striking when Catherine least expected, slicing through his armor with deadly precision. But Catherine was too strong. He caught Ethan by the throat, lifting him off the ground. You are nothing. Catherine snarled. Just another weak, reckless human. Ethan's vision blurred. Pain burned through his chest. But he grinned. You really don't get it, do you? He choked out. Catherine frowned. Ethan pulled the last mining charge from his belt. You should have never underestimated us. He jammed the detonator against Catherine's chest, and pressed it. Boom. The explosion sent them both flying. Ethan crashed into a column, pain flaring through his body. But when the dust cleared, Catherine was dead. Lyra stumbled toward Ethan, pulling him up. You're insane. Ethan grinned weakly. But I'm still alive. She shook her head, but her smile was warm. They had won. The aftermath. The battle was over. The Galactic Patrol had taken control. Catherine's forces had surrendered or fled. The warlord's empire had fallen. Ethan sat in the dauntless med bay, his ribs bandaged, his wounds healing. Lyra sat beside him, still wrapped in his damn jacket. You really aren't going to give that back, are you? He muttered. She smirked. Nope. Ethan sighed. Figures. Commander Valen entered the room, arms crossed. You pulled off the impossible, Drake. Ethan grinned. It's kinda what we do. Valen chuckled. The patrol needs people like you. How do you feel about sticking around? Ethan glanced at Lyra. Then he smiled. As long as I get to keep blowing stuff up. Lyra sighed. I knew you'd say that. Valen extended his hand. Welcome to the fight. Ethan shook it. Humanity had just changed the galaxy. And they were just getting started.